that you love. Nothing to be scared of now till the movie meets the sun.
Met a blue boy in the alabaster coat. He's searching only as good as the one you let go. I can't agree. I cannot with your eyes on me. Eyes on. Down exposure. I need closure. Baby, please just give me that. Down exposure. I need closure. Baby, please just give me that. Down exposure, I need closure, baby, please just give me that. Down exposure, I need closure, baby, please just give me that. There's a bunch of days they turn. Fire me to your place. You drink till my eyes burn. Oh, and you stood on the table, swinging your curls. Let the honey talk, let the honey walk. Here's my body, I can die for one. Here's my body, I can shine like a star. Here's my body, I can die for one. Here's my body, I can shine like a star. Into the morning, empty my pockets. Withdraw emotion, forgot your coat at the beach. Wipe the sand off your back, change it to the truck. Never been out this far, no, no. Stretch your legs on the hood, ay.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on this wonderful, wonderful, warm day in Michigan. I think it's 60 degrees today. We have the sun shining. I feel like I'm in the Caribbean, or maybe not. My name is Sophia Chu. I'm the Executive Director of the Caribbean Community Service Center, headquarters here in the great city of Detroit. We support, empower, and advocate for Caribbean nationals in the Americas. It is our honor and pleasure today to have our 4th annual Black History event. We remember also that Black history is our history, so it's not defined only by a month, but by every day of the year. Today, we're going to talk about the ancestral connections from Africa to the Americas by telling the stories of the Maroons, Garifunas, and Geechie. Our esteemed guests or storytellers today will kind of connect the dots for us as it regards our ancestors coming from Africa, showing their resiliency and their growth and determination here in the Americas. First up, we have storyteller Charlot Lucien. He is from Haiti, and he's a visual artist and a lecturer of Haitian culture and history. And he's based in Norwood, Massachusetts. He is the founder of the volunteer group Haitian Artists Assembly of Massachusetts. He has coordinated cultural events in New England to promote Haitian culture and bridge building cross-culture gaps, partnering with cultural, academic, and community groups. He has presented lectures, storytelling performance in the US, Canada, France, Guadeloupe, and Haiti. He is the author of 5 storytelling CDs in Haitian Creole and French, a poetry book, and 2 volumes of satirical caricatures. I had to pronounce that word a couple times there, Charlot, to make sure I got it right. He is the recipient of various awards for his cultural advocacy and his promotion of Haitian storytelling. In his professional life, he is a public health administrator, for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and has managed 4 years HIV/AIDS and refugee health and mental health programs. So I'm going to turn it over to Charlot to take it from there.
Hello, good afternoon from Boston, Massachusetts. How are you? Sophia, thanks for putting this together, and I'm really happy to be with with our friend Jerry Enriquez to try to establish those connections. And I would say, if you allow me, I'll be sharing some slides, and then I will come back to continue some considerations. So let me go ahead and do that now. If you can actually enable participant screen sharing, it's currently disabled. And to some of my friends from Michigan, I'm also saying hi. Hope to see you soon sometime. It is coming July. Okay. Here we go. We should be all set. Now, I'll go through those slides with some comments. First comment I want to make. People say Haiti, and I've come to realize that not everyone knows how and why. This island is called Haiti. Haiti literally means mountainous land. And this was the original name of the island that the Spaniards called Hispaniola, that the French will call Saint-Domingue, or later the Spaniards again will call Santo Domingo. However, the original Taino and Arawak, notice I'm not saying native Indians. There is no such thing as native Indians. We don't want to erase or to silence who they were. So Tainos and Arawaks, they call this land Haiti, which means mountainous lands, which is what you are looking at now. And this is where we'll be placing most of those Maroons from Haiti that we'll be talking about. And I'm going to assume, as we listen to Jerry, that the Garifuna and the Gulas also would have had the same similar experiences, whether in Jamaica, Belize, or St. Vincent, in those mountains. So I am literally placing a Haitian Maroon, Neg Marron, somewhere on the top of our mountains in the northern part of Haiti. Okay, nice slide. Give me 1 second. I'm seeing that this thing is frozen for no reason. So I'll keep going once it decides to collaborate, but as I continue, I wanted to start this presentation with a famous quote by Malcolm X. He had a series of speech that he rolled out in 1965. And in one of them, Malcolm X in Afro-American history, he said, so when you want to tell me about Black heroes, tell me about men who fought for freedom. Tell me about Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Toussaint Louverture, Henri Christophe, men who fought and bled for freedom and made others bleed. So when he said that, he had not actually had access to the extraordinary body of literature, of publication that came after the earthquake of 2010 in Haiti, that actually tells us how much not only the Dessalines, the Toussaint, and the Capois Mort did for independence, but also those unknown Maroons that have not been listed in our history books. I need to try it again in a few moments. So I'm quoting Malcolm X here because he usually helps me open up and share a series of information about Haitian history. I still have to try it again now to see if it works. So this is, again, Malcolm X's quote that I mentioned before. And by the way, this book is a good reference to try. The second thing I also want to point out, whether we are talking about Garifuna or Gula or Haitians, they actually expanded, in the case of Haiti, to touch or influence New Orleans. You heard about the impact of Kalalou Gombo or Cassava or Voodoo in New Orleans. We are discussing about Chicago. The founder of Chicago is Jean-Baptiste Pointe-Sable, and we celebrated him yesterday in an event. We are talking about the entire East Coast, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina with a Toussaint Louverture Cemetery, Virginia with a Toussaint Louverture Hospital. You get to Washington, you get to Philadelphia. There are ways to establish the presence of those descendants of the Maroons all over the East Coast and also in the Midwest as well. And again, I will tie for you the connections. Now, they did not just emerge from Haiti to expand in the US. Where did they come from ultimately? They came from you know about the Atlantic slave trade. Now look at this trajectory from this coast of Africa, whether you are talking about the Congo area, moving here, and to land in the West Indies, since we are talking about Jamaica, we are talking about Haiti, we are talking about Belize, and again, the so-called West Indies. You are looking at Congo, you are looking at Sierra Leone, you are looking at Senegal here, and then we continue and we have some 4.5 million people, humans, people who ended in the so-called West Indies, including Haiti. So from there, you can see again the expansion into those different places. So for us to understand what we are discussing now, we will look at the conditions or the concept of marronage, because there was a context for that if we refer to the transatlantic slave trade as a way to sustain European economy, or for those adventurers who presented themselves as investors to go into places and then to exploit, whether the gold, whether the soil, or to literally commit genocide to support their economic ambitions. It was also based on racism, as some people tended to see and look at other people through the lenses of racism, which was based on some false philosophical premises concocted. I'm going to mention a famous French philosopher by the name of Gobineau, who had established a certain ranking to put Black men or Black women closer to certain animals. So again, there was a context that led to people exploiting other people, and you are going to have the reaction of the marronage. So marronage is the term that we use both in Haitian Creole and in French to describe this form of resistance by slaves who run away from the plantations and establish themselves either as small bands or in large communities in remote areas or in nearby plantations. Now, although we tend to think about marronage in the context of Haitian history as part of what was happening primarily in the 18th century, however, after the Spanish invasion of Christopher Columbus, literally committed genocide and eliminated some 1 million Arawaks and Tainos on the island, they started to bring again those Africans, and right away they started to actually flee those plantations and to resist the condition they wanted to subject them to. And those conditions were grounded into legal construct in France particularly, where they have actually promoted le code noir. So this was the kind of legal framework that allowed those exploiters to consider those Blacks as slaves who had to be silenced and brutalized and exploited for the benefit of those masters. Personally, I came up with my own little definition of marronage as the resistance of the enslaved, who would actually, in the form of running away from the plantations, to deny to the oppressor control over their humanity, their bodies, their freedom, their families, their dignity, and their destiny. So this should be viewed in the same context as the use of poison, suicide, abortion, and bloody raids as coordinated forms of passive or active resistance to slavery. Now, what would be, or how do you understand to be, their means of survival? Because if they are fleeing those plantations, they are now in the wild. So for them to survive, first of all, they have to eat. They have to take care of their families now, because they are building not only small communities, but also at times large camps of Maroons. So clearly, they will at night conduct raids on plantations. They would use guerrilla tactics. That was to protect their camps, literally digging ditches around those camps and then putting stuff that would kill people if you fall in those ditches. We are also talking about nighttime raids that they would conduct at night in order to scare and to destabilize enemies that were sent after them, to capture them and to bring them back. The use of poison was definitely one of the main tools that people like Macandal, that was a chief Maroon, would use to instill fear and to destroy the plantation owners and their livestock as well, including folks who tended to support those plantation owners in their misdeeds. Now, for this to happen, there will be a price. There will be a cost. There would be punishment. We are talking about those Maroons now being chased by what was called the Maréchaussée. The system had enlisted people of color or mulattoes in order now to become an armed force that would chase the Maroons in the woods or in the mountains. And once they were captured, they would be whipped, chained, collared. They'll be branded. Think about it, hot iron on their flesh, mutilated, burned alive. And we should also think about the fact that we are talking about family separation. And if it has never been actually inserted before in those history books, yes, at this point, we have to understand the mental anguish that was inflicted upon those individuals or upon their family, because now we are aware of what mental health can do to people. Now, I put up this particular affiche It was a weekly publication that was coming up in French. You wouldn't be able to see it well. But two of the items, or two of the headings here, had to do with Maroons that were captured. And I took time to go through this particular section, even if you might not be able to see it. You might see the number 13 here. You might see the number 12 elsewhere. You might see the number 15. That tells us, the data tells us that at the time, you had young children, age 15, 12, 20, who are fleeing the plantations, who are captured, and who are going to be subjected to this list of torture that you see here. We also have others who are actually listed as 30 years old, 29 years old. And there are two things that was picked up here. First, some of them did not know the name of their masters, quote unquote. Some of them didn't even know their own name, because the only name that they knew was the African names that they came from, that were given to them by their parents, or if some of them were old enough, they came actually in the island with the African names. So this is the whole piece about dehumanizing human beings to the point that they don't know their name, they don't know their identity, or you want to force a certain name or a certain identity upon them, and they are totally lost. I resisted the desire to share more brutal illustration of what it meant. But you can just look at this image. The woman is being beaten, lashes, held by another Black man. The children is down on the floor, and probably here, the husband is being branded. So that alone gives you a sense of what the Maroon has to go through, because again, they would escape, they would be at time captured, and they would be quote unquote punished because they escaped. When we talk about the Maroons, a few things to keep in mind. So some of them actually would flee the plantation as individuals. They would still stick around, hide, and at night try to steal stuff in order to survive. Some of them who happen to have some skills would be able to get into town or into the cities, blend with other folks, and then because nobody knows who they were, and then try to survive. Now, these ones who managed to get at time into towns and cities were able to hear about conversations regarding revolution happening in France, regarding some more advanced either mulattoes or free Blacks who are discussing conditions to liberate themselves. So they will also become interesting, or they will become channels to get the message out that people needed to free themselves. So one of those famous Maroons would be Francois Macandal, 1730 to 1758. He was able to get together a network of like-minded Blacks who were working on the plantations and made of us some kind of secret society, some kind of secret organization, who knew the secrets of the leaves that could actually be transformed into poison in order to poison the plantation owners, in order to poison the animals, to destroy their livestock, and then to undermine, ultimately, the economy of the system. So a couple of things that they would do is conducting regular nighttime raids, burn the plantations, and kill the owners. Ultimately, he was captured in 1758 and burned alive. Now, the reason why he is famous, or actually his legacy is still actually alive today, the Haitian Republic in 1968 had money named after him, République d'Haïti, Macandal. That was to celebrate the achievements of Macandal. There are also in popular culture evocation of Macandal, where there have been theaters, there have been movies about him. One movie that some of you may know is called The Serpent and the Rainbow, that came out around, I think, 1986 by an anthropologist from Harvard. And in this very book and in this movie, they evoke the rebellion of Mackendal, who again was captured and killed in 1758. Now, let's try to understand or to have a sense of the impact of the legacy of the Maroon movement. First, what they discovered as they started to flee the plantations is that there were at times plantation owners who were willing to spare those punishment or to spare the torture if they would come back, because it was either they would lose the entire contingent of Maroons who fled the plantation, or they would spare them the punishment so that they can come back and work. Otherwise, they would lose their entire economic investment. So this was to show that when those movements happened in coordinated fashions by those Maroons, they were able to get some kind of relief. They also created this climate of fear among owners and rulers. This is what Mackendal was able to do, was he got this network and started to poison, to burn, and to kill the plantations. So this type of fear ultimately destroyed the myth that those Blacks were submissive creatures who would be willing to go along with the esclavagist system. We also found in our research that you have former warriors from Africa, from the Dahomey area, who, once they became Maroons, were able to apply or to use their skills as warriors. We are looking now at their guerrilla tactics, and those guerrilla tactics will be ultimately adopted by Toussaint Louverture, who will mastermind the whole abolition movement in Haiti before Dessalines took over to complete the movement with independence. Those Maroons, because they had fled in the mountains, when the revolution started to unfold, so they came on board supporting Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Some of those famous names are Sans Souci, Petit Noël Prieur, L'Amour d'Irance, Makala. So again, although history does not always give them credit, but somewhere in the background, somewhere in the mountains, they've been around to support and to make it real and to lead Haiti to the independence. Now, at some point, Napoleon Bonaparte, or France, that was forced to acknowledge the abolition of slavery in Haiti in 1793, and who would proclaim it officially in France in 1794, but they came back once Napoleon Bonaparte came on board and felt strong and secure enough to send an armada of 25 ships to try to reconquer the island, arrest the generals, and inflict slavery again. Now, a couple of things. There was a truce, and during those truce, the Haitian generals laid down their weapons. However, the ones who never capitulated, the ones who never gave up, were the Maroons, where they were hiding in the mountains. So I want to be realistic about it. We are not going to say that the Maroons ultimately led Haiti or led the revolution or led Haiti to independence. However, they instilled the seeds of the revolution, maybe not conceptually, but they provided the manpower, they provided the guerrilla tactic, they provided again this sense of the system is not invisible. We can win over the system. So that would be one part of their legacy. We also have what I would call their cultural legacy. Whenever you talk about Haiti and whenever you talk about music, you should always incorporate something about drumming, something about roots music. The drums were used, as you may know, to send messages from the top of the mountains down into the valley or to the top of other mountains to let other Maroons know that danger was coming. It was time to get ready or to flee. So we are going to say that the drumming remained both, you can look at it in a military context, but you can also look at it in terms of cultural legacy. We also found in our research that the descendants of the Manding, that we say in Creole or in French, the Mendigos, they still identify as such in the northern part of Haiti, in the area of Lembe or Lacule. So the way I usually look at this, I say that Haiti is still a Maroon experiment, meaning that we were able to set the island free. We were able to bring the revolution to fruition. We were able to become this first Black republic in the world. However, we still have to get out of the consequences of the slavery. Why? We, descendants of the Maroons, we are still paying the price because on one hand, think about it, France imposed with the international community, the US, Great Britain, an indemnity debt on Haiti, $25 billion in today's money that Haiti paid up to 1949. I can explain why after. And second, the US imposed an embargo on Haiti that literally strangled its economy. So as a result, Haiti has never been able to pick up economically and to become or to accomplish the great destiny that its founders set out for it. So that would be my piece here about the connection. The last image that I saw was the Neg Marron, and you saw two things in the background. You saw, on one hand, the National Palace that was destroyed after the 2010 earthquake that killed 250,000 people or more. You also saw the statue of Toussaint Louverture. To us Haitians, that was heavily symbolic. When this devastating earthquake took place, and the two monuments on the main public place of Haiti that remained and that were not destroyed were the Neg Marron, the unknown Maroon, and Toussaint Louverture, who knew how to learn from the Neg Marron in order to wage war against the French, which will ultimately lead to the independence of Haiti. So with that, thanks again, and I will pass it to Sophia for the next phase. Sophia.
Thank you so much. So we can see what our connections are to Africa. You could see it on the map. You can see it in our culture. So we can understand where we came from. We came to the Caribbean, the West Indies, and we made the best with the situations that we were put in. We are resilient people, and we continue to work hard to get to where we can now build legacy for our children. So thank you, Charlot, for your presentation. Please don't leave us because I know there's going to be some questions at the end that I want you to be able to facilitate the answers for it.
Sure.
So next, we have, so this is one of the great things about having meetings on Zoom, right? We can have folks from all over the world, all different cities, all in one space. So Charlot is in Boston, Massachusetts, by way of Haiti. And our next speaker is actually in his home country of Belize. So I am going to tell you a little bit about Jeremy and then turn the conversation over to him. Jeremy A. Enriquez, AKA Jerry Enriquez, is the son of several generations of paternal and maternal Garifuna ancestors from southern Belize. In his home country, he serves as a development consultant, educator, author, newspaper columnist, and an activist for conservation and indigenous land rights. He has published numerous newspaper articles on a number of social, economic, cultural, and development issues. His book, To Educate a Nation, Autobiography of Andres and Jane Enriquez, shares the unique story of the tremendous sacrifices of his grandparents, who, like many other Garifuna teachers of Belize, served as principal teachers in the remotest communities of Belize. He holds a master's in development studies from the University of the West Indies, a double major bachelor degree in psychology and sociology from Minnesota State University, and a diploma in education from Belize Teachers College. So I'm going to turn it over to Jerry for him to continue this great conversation. Thanks again for joining us, Jerry.
Thanks very much. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to participate in this discussion to bring more awareness of our people here in the Caribbean.
My speakers up all the way.
Somebody else's mic is on and is kind of feeding into my. Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to share my screen to give an overview of Garifuna history, to show some parallels to what Charlot was mentioning about the resilience of our African people in this part of the world. So let me just get the sharing screen right now. Okay, you all seeing that screen, I hope. Let me see what I can do here. Oops. Okay, I'm going to start this, I'm just going to give a quick overview of Garifuna history and then kind of trying to tie in what are the kinds of struggles that we are going through today, what are some of the achievements. Little is really known about Garifuna history actually over the Caribbean, because it's a small group of very resilient, very rebellious persons who came through from a line of rebellion during the time of the Haitian Revolution, but in another part of the Caribbean. And so just to give a kind of an overview of Garinago, actually the name of the people, we call ourselves Garinago, but the adjective for what we used and the language is called Garifuna. So we say Garifuna language, Garifuna food, Garifuna, but the people are called Garinago. And in ancient times, I guess it comes from Kalinago, also was used in the past. 6% of Belize's total population were found predominantly also in Honduras. 1% of the population of 10 million is Garifuna people. 0.1–0.3% of the population of Guatemala is Garinago. Guatemala is the largest Central American country. And then we have some scattered in the diaspora, mainly in the Bronx area of New York, and then in Los Angeles. So we're talking about roughly 400,000 persons, 400,000 Garinago. But very distinct group of Afro-indigenous descendant persons. Just because UNESCO in 2001 awarded Garifuna culture, or declared Garifuna culture as, and that was for the first time, as a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. Of great accomplishment, because unique to many Afro-descendant groups is Garifuna has a unique, Garifuna language is unique. It's not European based or anything. It is a blend of the indigenous Carib language mainly, with sprinklings of African words. So we have our own language, we have our own dance, we have our own forms of music, and we still maintain, like in IT, we still maintain many parts of our traditional spirituality, quite in contrast to what the Euro-American Christian religions would like. There is a great resistance in itself to maintaining our own traditional spiritualities, our own traditional healing, in the face of assault by modern institutions. So let me give a quick overview. The story does not necessarily start in 1635, but as far as documentation goes, the story is conveniently started there, even though there are other historical records that might go way further back. But the convenient story that we tell every year when we celebrate Garifuna's settlement day in Belize and in the rest of Central America is that there are two Spanish ships loaded with captured Africans destined for the Caribbean to be enslaved, was wrecked by a storm off the island of Bequia in the Grenadines near St. Vincent. And these Africans, those who survived the wreck, were welcomed into St. Vincent, where there were native Caribs. And there, over time, they intermingled with these native Caribs and became what the Europeans called Black Caribs, but we call ourselves Garinago. And so the Africans and the indigenous bronze-colored Caribs, they became merged into a culture of resistance. And over time, the Garinago were forced to defend their territory, their freedom, their existence, while the Europeans, French and British, sought to colonize and dominate and own that island. And in fact, when there was need to expand sugar plantations, the British went into St. Vincent in the area where the Garinago lived and tried, even since 1772, they tried cajolery, bribery, all manner of ways to try to get the Garinago out of those prime land where they were living peacefully. The British wanted to expand their sugar plantation. The Garinago were in their way, and so they had to find ways to get them out. Tired of consistent resistance, an all-out war erupted in 1796, where the Garinago fought against the British forces, and of course they were no match for the superior power of the British. And therefore, when they refused to surrender, the Garinago were hunted down, their houses and canoes were burned, their leaders were killed, their crops and their food were destroyed. And the people were rounded up, they were captured and transported to a barren rock called Baliseo, right off the island of St. Vincent. Many of them, and that's a sad part of Garifuna history that we tell every year. There's a specific date, November 19th, where Garifuna people in Honduras, Belize, right around that time, Nicaragua, Guatemala, tell their stories each year to their children about that journey and those kinds of experiences that they have. I'll talk about that a little more later. So at Baliseo, in this barren island rock, of the 4,338 who were placed there until the British tried to decide what to do with these people, because originally there was discussion to deport them all to Africa, but that would have been an expensive venture. And therefore, they were just there on this barren island where an epidemic erupted, 2,100 died. And before it was decided then, to exile the remaining 2,238 and banish them forever from their homeland, just because the colonizer wanted their land. And so on March 11, 1797, that number, 2,238 Garifuna persons, were banished from St. Vincent forever. During that, so they were loaded onto ships and they were shipped to a remote island in the Caribbean off the coast of Honduras called Roatan. during that 1 month journey in about 8 British ships. Over 200 died. And those who landed on April 12, 1797 on the island of Roatan, 2,026, of which 664 were men, 1,366 were women. They were landed and left to the mercy of the elements. They had to fend for themselves. So they were landed at Roatan, given some provisions of food, and the British said, well, you're on their own. So the Garifuna people had to find ways to survive. Some of them migrated to the mainland Honduras in search of some kind of job to fend for themselves. Some joined the military at the time in Honduras. Others, by 1802, 5 years later, a group of Garifuna men were imported into the settlement of Belize to cut mahogany. Mahogany was in high demand in Europe. The enslaved Africans in Belize were escaping to neighboring republics, and therefore there was a shortage of labor when there was a high demand for mahogany. So the settlers, the white settlers in Belize at the time, decided to import, to bring in Garifuna laborers to work in Belize. They were the first free group of blacks to be in Belize. Remember that all this resistance with the British was for them not to be enslaved after their memory of escaping from the slave ships, and they maintained their communities free from being enslaved at the time, those descendants. So they heavily resisted slavery. So even while that period of time of the Haitian Revolution was happening, in St. Vincent, there was the British Carib War, as it was called, for them to resist British domination and taking away of their lands. When they arrived in Belize, between August and December 1802 was the first arrival of Garinago to Belize. They were not allowed to remain in the settlement where other enslaved Africans were, because there was fear that the free Garifuna persons, the free Garinago, would foment rebellion amongst those who were enslaved. So the British physically and psychologically separated the two groups of blacks. The Garifuna were placed in southern part of the territory in what is now part of Belize. It's like over 100 miles physical distance between the two groups, just to ensure that these groups did not. That would have profound effects in the long term, because of the two groups maintaining suspicion against each other even after slavery was abolished. And even up to today, there's sometimes remain some subtle inklings of those who were enslaved and were favored by the British, and those who had fought the British and had to remain physically distant, but their labor was needed for the harvest of mahogany. The British planted seeds of suspicion amongst the enslaved to consider the Garinago as very dangerous people, as cannibals, as devil worshippers, as all kinds of negative names to create and build the suspicions, just so that these two groups cannot get together to rebel. Today, on November 1823, there's the biggest influx of Garifuna to Belize to join family members. They were escaping the civil wars in Central America at the time, in the wars for independence. And so there was a mass influx. I show this picture because each year, November 19th, Garinago reenact their arrival in Belize. So you have people loaded onto boats, they're drumming, there is celebration when they're coming into the shores. So there's a reenactment of that time. That is to reinforce the history among the upcoming generations. It's a way of teaching them that we have survived and we were resilient against all attempts to really exterminate us. Our language intact, our music, our dance, against every assault on our culture. So it's a celebration of resilience. So Garifuna played two major roles in the building of Belize. First, they came, as I mentioned, to cut mahogany, which provided economic stability at the time. For over 100 years, they're working in the mahogany plantations. But at the same time, the Catholic Church at the time had a preference for hiring Garifuna men as teachers to serve in the remotest part of Belize, just because they were already used to working deep in the forest as in search of mahogany, to harvest mahogany. And those who were the brightest in the education system, and because they were descendants of these mahogany cutters, but also because they were descendants who moved to Belize from Honduras, that means they spoke Spanish, they had their native Garifuna language, and also spoke English. So they were seen as the best group of people to hire to open schools in the remotest part. They already spoke Spanish, they already spoke English, they already spoke Garifuna, but also they were most interested always to learn new languages. When I grew up within my own family home, my father spoke 5 of the native languages that we speak in Belize. He spoke Maya, Mopan, Maya, Geechie, Garifuna, Spanish, English. Those are the languages that crisscross my home, my aunts, my uncles, because they were all teachers. I come from a family of teachers. So this is part of, I'll just go through some pictures to show these part of the celebration each year, November 19, to reenact the arrival of Garifuna to Belize. It's the Garifuna flag. The black stands for the Black African ancestors, the yellow for our native Caribs, and the white for peace. But also some suggest that the white for the oppressors who tried to exterminate us. But then we found peace through our resilience. The making of the cassava bread, all these are currently happening, but these practices have survived hundreds of years of attempts to totally exterminate our culture. So cassava bread is one of our staples that we eat even today. And other Carib groups, indigenous Carib groups, I saw a woman in Suriname, in the remote part of Suriname, native Carib, making cassava bread. Our dance preserved, little kids drumming. Drumming is a part of our culture. Our music has transcended Belize and our Central American countries to the world. Here we see our famous Garifuna artist, Andy Palacio, and his mentor, Paul Nabor, on a world stage. Garifuna music, Andy Palacio was one of our biggest Garifuna stars who made our music known worldwide as part of our communal value. Here's Garifuna persons and other volunteers building our spiritual temple called the Dabuyaba, where worship takes place, and the women also as a part of it. Our song, our dances, and even after all the work and the spiritual celebration, this is what a Dabuyaba looks like after an all-night drumming, dancing session. People are overflowing outside, resting in their hammocks before another session of drumming, dancing, spiritual intervention, and the call of the ancestors. All to say that, of course, we try to put this in a nutshell, but through all those years of attempted extermination by the British, and when they came to Belize by the colonial government, even by the church itself, trying to exterminate. The church leaders used to call us on our spirituality works of the devil. It still remains, it still survives today. This is a forum for family reunion, to reaffirm family connections. And my book captures that in its essence, to educate a nation, looking at the role that my grandparents played and their children, my father included, in the education of those in the remotest part of Belize over decades. So that's pretty much in a nutshell, showing the resilience of our people ever since the shipwreck of that ship that was destined for us to be enslaved, and how events shifted for us to be where we are today. Thanks very much. I'll leave it at that, and hoping for questions and discussion.
Thank you, Jerry. I appreciate it. So what I'm going to do now, we're going to open it up for discussion, because I know we have some very eager people that are a part of the meeting, and I know we have some exciting things to talk about, some comments. But one of the things I wanted to kind of let the group that we have know is that although Maroons are a critical part of our history, especially in the Caribbean, me being Jamaican, it wasn't one of the things that was talked about a lot. You had to seek out the information about Maroons. It wasn't like something, I don't remember it being taught to me in school. I remember hearing about the Maroons. I remember hearing that they were enslaved people that ran away because they didn't want to be slaves and moved to the harshest parts of our country. In Jamaica, it's called the Cockpit Country, a compound town being a part of it. I remember them talking about Nanny, who is one of our heroines, but I did not hear them talk about, for example, Dottie Bookman, who is a connecting point with the Haitian Revolution. So as you know, we're going through cultural sensitivity training with the Caribbean Community Service Center, talking, centralizing our conversation around empathy, education, and engagement. We thought it was critical that we have this conversation amongst the African diaspora as it regards the Caribbean people. So meeting Jerry and Charlot kind of tied those things together for me mentally. So now I'm going to kind of open it up to the audience to see if they have any comments they'd like to share. Robert, if you could kind of drive keep us organized as it regards the comments and the questions that are there, so we can talk about it just a tad bit to kind of let each other know that we've gone through similar experiences and we need to continue to support each other through empathy, education, and engagement. So when we get into spaces that we're representing ourselves, we can represent each other holistically. So Robert, you want to kind of tell us who we have that has questions or comments at this point?
Maggie had a question, Margaret Corkery. And I guess it'd be good if we just say it out loud so we can get everybody into the conversation.
So the question, Maggie, you want to go ahead and ask the question?
No, I just want, Jerry answered the question. My question was, what was the origin of the name Kalinagu? And he said it was Kalinagu found in St. Vincent and Dominica. So thank you, Jerry.
You're welcome.
I also had a question for Charlot. So you talked about the Mandango descendants in the northern part of Haiti. Can we hear a little bit more about that, and how did they trace back their lineage?
So when we talk about the Mandango, they usually claim that this is a group that came from the area of Benin, Senegal. The way it worked back in the days is that those slave ships would most likely land in the northern part of Haiti. So those Maroons are the ones who took into the mountains and stayed there. Most of the fighting took place again in the northern part of Haiti. At time there was a regular army under Toussaint Louverture and under Jean-Jacques Dessalines. And those who were formerly enrolled into the army would conduct battles against the French invaders of Rochambeau, Napoleon Bonaparte, or Leclerc. However, Toussaint had managed to meet in person with the leaders of those Maroons. There are names like that I mentioned before: Sans Souci, Noël Prieur, Dieudonné, Makaya. So apparently, because they always stayed in the mountains and refused to formally engage unless they have to really fight and push away the French who were trying to control them. So over time, from generation to generation, they kept their identity. So what I got here was from Professor Monestim, who is still conducting some research to see if there could be some formal documentation. But apparently, in the area of Lembe, Plaisance, and Grande Rivière du Nord, there are individuals who claim or who self-identify as descendants of the Manding by virtue of talking about their grandfather or their grandmother. It has yet to be again documented, but we're just going at this point to take it at their word.
Okay, thank you so much. Both presentations were great. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
And Dr. and Elrington had a question regarding first, the reparations that were paid by the Haitian people for the end of slavery.
Ha. Okay. You want to ask it live in case you have details, so I can just go ahead and respond?
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Elrington, if you're online.
Yes, thank you for two brilliant presentations. They're exactly what I expected, and I learned so much. It was painful to hear the infliction of, the torture on families, with children watching, men being forced to watch their women tortured, etc. I wanted to know, though, why the financial toll has been exacted on Haiti. I visited Haiti myself, and I've seen two of the statues that Charlot mentioned, and I just wanted to know how we can't get away from that, like why the world hasn't done more.
So there are two parts to your question. There is first the historical part. Right after Haiti's independence, I like to usually say that Dessalines enacted or entered history with three major acts. First, what was called Saint-Domingue or Santo Domingo, he declared, will be known from now on January 1st, 1804, as Haiti. He went back to the native denomination of the island by Ararat and Taínos. Second, because they were able again to defeat the French troops, and remember, they had defeated the Spanish troops, the British troops, and finally the French troops, expelled from Haiti. Now, some white folks who are still in the island were claiming that it was a temporary victory and that Napoleon will send more troops to re-enslave them. Some of them were literally acting as spies and then sending information to the Santo Domingo part, right now the Dominican Republic part, providing information on the Haitian troops. So Dessalines decided to conduct a massacre of some 5,000 remaining French who were in the island. Now, it was not an anti-white type of measure because he had spared Polish soldiers who had decided to stay and fight alongside of the Haitian Revolution. He has spared white French who were either doctors, who were educators, who wanted to stay and who had embraced the freedom of Haiti. So after the independence, some of those whites were either absentee owners who were living in France, or some of those whites who fled the island, or some who lost their family members, claimed that they had actually incurred enormous economic losses. And as a result, for France to recognize the independence of Haiti, Haiti needed to pay some kind of indemnity to those families and to those colonizers, to those owners, so that they won't actually be the full or the total losers of this revolution. Now, this was clearly an abnormal request and it was rejected. However, for the other nations, Great Britain, the US, several Latin American countries, for them to establish diplomatic relationship with Haiti, France needed to claim or to say that we relinquish ownership of our former colony. So French actively advocated to Thomas Jefferson not to conduct business with Haiti. Other countries did the same. So remember, the first Black Republic, totally isolated. Everyone is afraid of this island that was actually able to defeat all those European powers. So the only way for Haiti to establish trade with other countries and to be able to trade and sell and receive things that they needed to build the country, apparently, was to agree to pay this debt of independence. So between 1804 and 1825, they systematically rejected those claims. As a matter of fact, at some point, France sent an emissary by the name of Medina to Enriquez in the north. Enriquez got Medina and his two colleagues arrested and shot. So that means they were ready to engage into battle. However, the economic reality is that you have now an entire conglomerate of other nations with whom you need to make trade or to have trade in order to survive. So there needs to be some kind of diplomatic relation. So France agreed actually to say, okay, we now relinquish ownership of the colony. For that, the US, Jefferson and others will do that. So put it this way, although what they paid at the time seemed to be a small amount, but an economist, a French economist, Thomas Piketty, did some calculation and claims that the amount paid by Haiti from 1826 to 1949 is equivalent to $25 billion of US currency today, which means that if Haiti had not been strangled by first this indemnity debt, and second, by the way, the US would also impose an embargo from 1804 up to 1862 on Haiti. Lincoln would actually release or remove this embargo, which also again would squeeze and prevent Haiti from doing business with a natural partner that was also promoting supposedly liberty, equality, and fraternity.
Pastor Wayne Ramakan had a question.
Thank you, Robert. Very, I agree with the sentiments. Excellent presentations. Thank you so very much. Sophia alluded earlier to the Kampong Maroons in Jamaica in the Carpet Country. And actually I invited Chief Courage to be with us, but because of other obligations, he could not commit, and he was going to try his best to be here, but I noticed he has not logged on yet. But I don't know if everyone here knows that that community in Jamaica is about 1,000 residents. And so I'm aware of that as a sovereign, separate state, so to speak, within Jamaica, self-governing. So I was wondering, in Belize and Haiti, do you have a community like that? And if you do, could you tell us a little bit about it? And if you don't have a community like that, do you know why that's not the case? If there's not a community like that established in Haiti or Belize, and whoever wants to go first is fine.
Okay, let me take that first. Your mention of the Akompong and their being recognized as a separate state is very, I found it very interesting. And there were discussions early on in Garifuna history to establish their own part of Belize, and not as a separate state, but to have it more tightly knit as a community. But that was not allowed, of course, just because of the colonial education system, the colonial rules, that even though we had separate communities in those early times, we'd have the Mayas in their own communities, but not as a separate state, even though de facto they existed sort of like a separate state with their own communal land values that they lived. In Garifuna communities, you have small communities like Barranco, Hopkins, and others where they were predominantly Garifuna, and they maintained that for a while. And each ethnicity, you have Creole communities, you have Mestizo communities. I guess because of the wide space and expanse of the country, very sparsely populated, they existed as in their own close-knit community and close-knit communal values. As the population expanded and as people intermarried and as we have more inflows of visitors into Belize, these communities became quite mixed. And in fact, in many Garifuna communities right now, they're not predominantly Garifuna anymore. There's influx of mestizos, there's influx of just because of industry, because of work availability. There was a major influx of Central Americans in the banana industry, for example, and they moved to settle in Hopkins and in Dangriga and other Garifuna communities. And so it just diluted the population of Garifuna in a sense. And likewise in the Creole communities in the Stand Creek Valley is now predominantly to a large extent with Central Americans who were brought in to work as a source of cheap labor in the citrus and banana farms, and that is how they maintain cheap labor over time. If the workers complained, then they were deported, so and they wanted to stay and they brought their children. And so the population of Belize is increasingly becoming more Hispanic. An interesting point that was raised in the question was the time when there was suggestions for Haitians to come and live in Belize, especially near the Garifuna communities. This was in the early 1980s, and there was some turmoil in Haiti, and there was the discussion to bring Haitian refugees into Belize to sort of boost the Black population in Belize, quite aware that there was also the Central American wars and there was an influx of Central Americans into Belize. Interestingly, the Creole elites, especially those who were more closely aligned with colonial values, made the strongest resistance against Haitians coming to live in Belize among the Garifuna. And they influenced the government, they are part of the government, and so that did not happen, even while there was thousands of Central Americans coming into Belize. And right now, in fact, then the African descendant former majority that made up Belize are now the minority population in Belize. Combined Creole Blacks and Garifuna Blacks in Belize are now about 30% when they were over 50% earlier in history, and that number keeps reducing. There was another attempt even later in the 80s, again, the discussion to bring in Haitian refugees to settle in Belize, and those kinds of discussions somehow are consistently knocked off the table. So just wanted to show that. So Belize is becoming less and less Afro-descendant and more Hispanic.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Brother Jerry.
Okay. Thank you for your question, Pastor. I'll drop maybe a couple of considerations. once the Haitian Revolution succeeded and then independence took place in Haiti, there was no more need to have Maroon communities because we were essentially the Maroons who were trying to stay clear from the oppression, the injustice, and the exploitation by those white masters. So with independence, being a Maroon became a moot point. But what I want to, or I like to ironically point out, because we were essentially the Maroons, people throughout the world who'd be fleeing persecutions themselves would always end up in this island where they heard those people are always willing to take on troublemakers. So you will find out that when Bolivar had to flee Venezuela, when he was losing the battle against the Spaniards, he ended in Haiti in 1816 for a full year. Same thing also happened with Miranda, one of the other leaders from Venezuela. Jose Marti in 1893 also went to Haiti as he was preparing actually to revolt against the Spanish armies in Cuba. So you will find throughout history a number, actually I'm going to also say Poles from Poland in 1830, fleeing the Russian invasion in Poland in 1830, some of them went to Haiti. So ironically, Haiti became, let's put it this way, the Maroon nation by excellence. And now people who are fleeing other situations would end up in Haiti. So no, we don't have a specific Maroon community. I mentioned earlier that we have Mendigos who trace themselves to the earlier Maroons in the northern part of Haiti, but they have no more reason to act as Maroons because they have access everywhere in the country since this is now their country.
Okay, we could spend all week talking about this. Great, 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 great stories, guys. It's so interesting to hear about where we came from, right? We're always fighting against each other or having opinions about each other without knowing who, where we come from and how strong we are at the root. So you guys were able to share that with us today because the stories are so similar. The place is different, the individuals are different, but the stories are still the same. And these are the things that we now have to grasp to turn into legacy items for our children. So thank you guys again so much for spending this afternoon with us. Thank you for the time to prepare your stories. I can't wait to meet you guys in person. I think I'm gonna go to Belize. Dr. Ann, you're listening? I think I'm going to go to Belize now that I have found a friend that lives in Belize.
Welcome.
In Inkster. And then I think I'm gonna meet Charlot this summer when he comes for the Haitian festival in July. So my plan is to catch up with you guys so we can have even deeper conversations about this. I wanted to tell you guys that this is what the Caribbean Community Service Center does. We support, empower, and advocate for Caribbean nationals on all levels, educationally, professionally when it comes to business owners, community advocacy, community service, sports, arts, and culture. Please stay tuned to our social media pages. We're on Facebook as the Caribbean Community Service Center. We're on IG as the Caribbean Community Service Center. And we will have this video up via YouTube shared on those platforms so you can share them with your housemates, your friends, folks that want to know more about us as Caribbean people. And we ask that you tell people about how strong our roots are. A program that we're actually very proud of that we're working to roll out this year again is our Melanin Girls program. It's the Ancestral celebration of Caribbean women. It's for our young ladies that are aged 10 through 14. It runs for 6 weeks in the summer. So stay tuned to see when we're rolling that out because we are looking for young ladies to be involved, young ladies of Caribbean heritage. I am Sophia Chu, the Executive Director of the Caribbean Community Service Center. Thanks to all the folks that are a part of the program today. Thanks to Robert for helping us with the moderation. Thanks for Wayne, who both of them are directors of our organization. Thank you guys for coming out, and all the other members that are here that I haven't been able to see who are here. So again, stay strong. Let's be empathetic. Let's learn about each other from an educational standpoint, and let us continue to engage with each other. Have yourself a wonderful, wonderful evening. Robert is indicating something.
Somebody asked if where can we get the books? Are they on Amazon?
Yes, my book is on Amazon.
I have a copy.
Oh, thank you.
I have to get mine.
And I'm next is Charlot's books, because I'm a poet myself, so I'm looking for Charlot's books so I can compare our poetry.
You'll have it in July.
All right, thank you guys again so much. We're gonna wrap up now. Have yourself a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful Sunday. Take it easy.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.